This is chapter 14 on using interviews and focus groups. So here are your learning objectives. First, you'll be able to decide on the most appropriate use and design of interviews and focus groups for particular research projects. Secondly, you'll be able to design and develop appropriate interview and focus group schedules for your own research. And lastly, you'll be able to critique the use of interviews and focus groups in research. So as an introduction, interviews and focus groups are data gathering methods. So these two methods are most frequently used to generate qualitative research. Interviews are generally used when the researcher can identify key respondents in relation to the phenomenon under investigation and can engage these respondents in an interview process. So focus groups are generally used when the researcher wants the participants to focus on particular phenomenon, and through group discussion around that focus which generates some ideas and insights to the phenomenon. So focus groups are used when a group dynamic would be useful to the research agenda and to the participants in the research. Focus groups are efficient ways of gathering data simultaneously from a range of participants. So there are 5 different types of interviews. First, we have one-to-one interview. Secondly, you have group interview. Thirdly, you have telephone interview. Fourth, you have online interview. And lastly, we have photo elicitation interview. So how do we actually conduct interviews? First, you have to decide on what interview technique to use and then plan the interviews. So in planning the interviews, in your textbook in table 14.1, there is a step-by-step guide to conducting interviews. I will go over the steps in the next few slides. So using the research diary, this will ensure that there is a secure record that you keep on the process that you actually plan out. So this planning process will help identify any potential issues or problems in the interview process. It will also facilitate proper preparation for the interviews. So the notes from the research diary will be of help when you write up the process in your research methodology chapter in your thesis or your section for the report of a research project. So this is table 14.1 and the step-by-step of conducting interviews. So first you will need to decide on an interview method, whether it's one-to-one, group telephone, or online interview, or others. Next, you need to devise the interview schedule. So the interview schedule is highly structured in interviews where it relates to quantitative research. So it is generally either unstructured or semi-structured in interviews in qualitative research. So the next step is basically to select interviewees using the appropriate sampling method. So we have discussed this in chapter 10. The next step is to contact interviewees and invite them to participate. The next part of the interview process is basically to provide interviewees with formal information on the research. So in this part, the important part of this process is basically having an informed consent and making the participants understand about what we require of them. Next, we have setting up interviews and conducting the one-to-one interviews or face-to-face interviews. Next, we have, if you're not doing one-to-one interviews or face-to-face interviews, we have telephone interviews, group interviews, online interviews. So basically, what you need to bear in mind is different kinds of interviews would require different requirements. Okay, so the details are in that table where you can refer. So focusing on the next part of this chapter is interviewing in quantitative research. So interviews are conducted differently in quantitative compared to qualitative research. In quantitative research, the researcher decides what needs to be known, and he or she designs a very precise data gathering instrument to gather data in order to create knowledge. So in quantitative research, interviews are conducted in a structured, systematic manner. The researcher rigidly follows that structured interview schedule, asking each interviewee the same questions in the same order. Okay, so what about interviewing in qualitative research? So this slide explains that in qualitative research, interviews are more loosely structured and the interview schedule is either unstructured or semi-structured. So he or she does this in order to allow research participants to control and shape the information that is gathered and consequently the knowledge generated by the research project. So in qualitative research, interviews are conducted in a flexible manner, and the focus of the interview is exploring the interviewee's perspectives. Okay, so we've talked about the interview schedule. Let's just look at an example of it. So the interview schedule is actually the list of questions to be asked or issues to be explored in the interview. If the interview schedule is long, questions are grouped into sections so that the issues raised can be dealt with thoroughly, efficiently, and systematically. So the interview schedule begins with background questions. So as you can see here on the left side, we have an example of a research project on brand loyalty among third level students. So we have the first question would be on introductions of how the research is going to be conducted, and then also an introduction to the aim of the focus group. Alright, so there will be explanation on how it's going to be conducted. So there will be, in this case, one speaker at a time. There should be balanced discussion. The views of all participants are required, and then there will be some sort of recording mechanism. So all this will be dealt with at the beginning of the interview. So after you settle the background questions and basically set out the ground rules of the interview, the more general questions will follow, and then finally moving to specific questions on the phenomenon under investigation. Okay, so in this case, on the right side, we have issues for discussion. So it includes number 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then we have an element where the moderator would need to sum up the whole discussion and then thank the participants and providing the feedback of the whole interview. Okay, so we move on to this term called interview probes. So standardized probes are written into the interview schedule. So this is to ensure that if probing is used, the same probing is used with each interviewee. So when probing an interview, interviewers say things like, "Could you tell me a little bit more about that?" Or, "Could you say a little more about that?" Or the interviewer might simply make an encouraging noise such as Okay, so the interviewer does not want to bias the interview by leading the interviewee in their responses. So such bias is known as interviewer bias or researcher bias. So the interview schedule in quantitative research basically guides the interview, and it ensures that every interviewee is asked exactly the same questions. So this is necessary in ensuring that the data gathered for the research is gathered in a rigorous, systematic manner. So structured interview schedules are generally comprised mostly of closed questions. So in the next slide, we will discuss about closed and open questions. So closed questions are questions which provide respondents with a restricted set of options in terms of possible answers. For example, yes or no, or sometimes, often, regularly. So the possible responses to closed questions can be pre-coded to ensure that the data gathered can be easily and quickly analyzed. So open questions are questions which do not anticipate responses, and they are questions to which the respondents may respond in any unique and individual way. So open questions are used to explore respondents' understandings, feelings, and beliefs. So they usually require thought and reflection on the part of respondents, and they usually generate long responses. So the next few slides will talk about bias in research. So bias in research is anything that contaminates or compromises the research. So as this broad definition of bias indicates, bias can be introduced to a research project at any stage of the research project. So bias can refer to a particular perspective that the research takes which highlights some aspects of findings of the research while ignoring or even hiding others. So bias can also refer to some systematic error that has somehow been introduced to the research. So there are different kinds of bias, and this slide explains about researcher bias. So researchers can themselves be the cause of bias. So for example, researchers can be biased in favor of a particular result or finding in their research. They can have a particular view and want that view confirmed by the study, rather than keeping an open mind as to what the study might confirm. So through the use of what are known as leading questions, the researcher can influence participants in the study through the wording of the questions and the emphasis they place on the different words and concepts in the questions, and through encouraging and affirming particular responses. So they can influence the findings of the research through the design of the study also. Okay, so researcher bias is one of the examples of bias. Next is sampling bias. So sampling bias occurs when the sampling procedure used in the research is flawed or compromised in some way. So researchers can introduce sampling bias into their study if the population or sample used in their study is biased in favor of a particular population or sample population. So population samples that underrepresent some of the members of the population will bias the research. So bias can be introduced through non-responses when the non-respondents in the study differed in some significant way to the respondents. Next is respondent bias. So respondents can respond in a patterned way to each question. So when a respondent gives a patterned set of responses to a set of questions, for example, answering yes to every question or answering no to every question, this is a form of bias. So this kind of bias happens when a respondent agrees with everything the researcher says. So that is also a form of bias. The next issue is that there is social desirability bias, where it occurs when a respondent gives the socially desirable or the politically correct response rather than an honest response. The next issue under respondent bias is prestige bias, where this occurs when the respondent is influenced in responding through their perception of the prestige of a group or individual. For example, the use of words like doctor or president or excellent might introduce prestige bias. So how do we actually eliminate bias? So researchers try to eliminate bias from the research if they find that despite their best efforts, they have not managed to eliminate 100% bias from their research, they should acknowledge that their study is biased, or that it may be to some degree biased. So researchers try to identify possible sources of bias in their research, although it is not always possible to do this. So when researchers identify a possible source of bias, they will deal with it and they will acknowledge it. So the next part is basically talking or focusing on focus groups. So a focus group is used in research as a data collection method to bring a group of people together, and there is one person where we call them as a moderator to focus on a specific topic under investigation in the research project. So the people invited to participate in the focus group must be experts in some way on the phenomenon under investigation. So focus group aims at a discussion instead of individual responses to formal questions. Okay, so this is the difference between group interviews and focus groups. So we have face-to-face or online focus groups. So focus groups can be face-to-face or online, and online focus groups can be synchronous in real time or asynchronous out of real time. So in synchronous online focus groups, the focus group happens in real time using chat rooms or focus group software. Using conference software, the participants in the focus group can see each other. Using other software, that type contributions of participants are basically visible to all the participants. Okay, so in asynchronous online focus groups, the focus group happens out of real time, and the focus group issues or questions are posted for the participants prior to the actual time the interview is actually open, and then participants can engage the issues and questions and respond to the focus group facilitator or moderator in their own time, as it is asynchronous. Okay, so now we'll move on to critique the use of interviews and focus groups in research projects. So the list of questions are in table 14.5 in your textbook, which can be useful in terms of developing a critique of any research that use interviews and focus groups. It can provide you with guidance in terms of critique likely to be basically asked at any interviews and focus group you may carry out for your own research. Okay, so these are the things that you might need to go through before actually deciding on whether you should do an interview or focus group. Okay, so we have several questions here, and then most of it are needed for you to reflect whether you have the justification on whether it is suitable for you to use interview or focus group. Okay, so as an examiner, for example, these questions are very useful. Okay, so for example, how many interviews or focus groups were conducted? How were the interviews or focus groups conducted? Was this appropriate? Where did the interview or focus group take place? Okay, so as you can see, these are the questions that can help you decide on what to write in the sections of chapter 3 or your research methodology chapter. Okay, so that's all for this chapter.